So just as a brief overview of the talk, I'm going to kind of real briefly talk about why early algebra. So I think talking to a math ed group probably doesn't need a whole lot of kind of explanation why early algebra is important, but I'll hit a few bulleted points there. I'll talk a little bit about what do I mean by a comprehensive approach to early algebra. Give you an overview of Project LEAP and the studies, so that's going to be primarily what I'm going to talk about today. And I don't know if I'll answer the question of does early algebra matter, but I want to pose that question and give some of the evidence that we have to date. And then what I mean by developing a comprehensive program of early algebra. Oh, and also I guess I'm going to talk about big picture lessons learned from the decade of work that we've been doing in early algebra. So the algebra problem, as many of you know, too many students have been unsuccessful in algebra. It's also been talked about and written about a lot that algebra is a gatekeeper to future educational and employment opportunities. And arithmetic in elementary school does not adequately prepare students for success in algebra. I think part of that has to do with the kind of abrupt transition from the concrete thinking of arithmetic to the more abstract thinking required in algebra, and that's a pretty abrupt transition for many students. So a solution that's been kind of proposed over the last several decades is the idea of early algebra. So as many of you I'm sure know, it's not a matter of just taking the formal algebra of secondary school and moving it into the elementary grades, or taking the topics from Algebra 1 and moving them down into the elementary grades. It's really a way of thinking about algebraic thinking as a K-12 strand. That's something that permeates math education across all grade levels. That builds on children's informal intuitions and thinking about patterns, relationships, and structure. And that it's long-term and sustained algebra experiences. So not just algebra once in a while, but really needs to be a continuous part of their math education. So most of the early algebra research over the past several decades has kind of coalesced around four kind of major areas. So research that's looked at mathematical equivalence, so things about the equal sign. So Tom Carpenter and his colleagues have done lots of work in that area in the elementary grades. Generalized arithmetic, so looking at kind of properties and identities. So Deborah Shifter and her colleagues are some of the people that have really done a lot of work in this area. And then multiple representations, so different ways of representing mathematical ideas, whether it's in tables, with symbols, with graphs. David Carhar and his colleagues have done a lot of work in this area. And then functional thinking, so how do students think about covariant quantities? So Jim Caput and his colleagues over the years have done a lot of work in that area as well. These aren't meant to be kind of mutually exclusive categories either, but these are kind of the big areas that much of the early algebra research has kind of been done around. So the one question is, what do I mean by a comprehensive approach to early algebra? So most of the early algebra efforts have not been comprehensive in their treatment of the content and practices of early algebra. So in the previous slide, for example, Tom Carpenter and his colleagues focused on the equal sign quite a bit, but they didn't look at functional thinking. They didn't look at kind of different representations, or didn't look at generalized arithmetic as much. And so a lot of the work is really focused on one particular domain within early algebra. Much of it hasn't been longitudinal in its efforts to study long-term development, so it's often focused on a particular grade level, so maybe grade 3, maybe grade 5, but it really hasn't looked long-term at students' understanding of these early algebra ideas and practices. And it's often been researcher-led or researcher-intensive, so either the researchers themselves are teaching kind of the early algebra content to the elementary classrooms, or it's very kind of intensive in the sense of a lot of professional development with teachers around teaching the early algebra. And so one of the things that, is it possible for regular classroom teachers to engage in these kinds of activities without the intensive kind of resources needed provided by kind of research? And it's often not integrated with or builds on kind of the arithmetic curriculum. So it's often kind of, this is algebra day, or we're going to do some algebra today that has nothing to do with the arithmetic. And so thinking about ways that we can build on what students are already doing in the elementary curriculum in a way that brings out the kind of early algebra character of the arithmetic. So Project LEAP is what I'm going to focus the bulk of the talk on, and this is our, as many of you kind of faculty know and grad students may be learning, a big part of funded research is coming up with acronyms for your project names. So Project LEAP was learning through an early algebra progression. So that kind of took a while to come up with that, but that's our kind of catchy Project LEAP is the project I'm going to be talking about. And so this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a decade-long series of projects that we've been doing, really trying to answer the question of, are students who experience a comprehensive and sustained early algebra education, are they better prepared for success in more formal algebra than students who have gone through kind of a business-as-usual elementary curriculum? So that's kind of the question we sought out to answer, was the question of, does early algebra matter? Does it make a difference for students when they hit algebra in the secondary school?
Sorry, can I ask a quick question about that? Were you also looking at introduction for early algebraic ideas in support of kind of what had historically been taught in those classrooms? It's kind of like mutually supportive idea, or was it all about like putting in places for this type of future trajectory?
Some of both, more of the latter. So we were particularly interested in students learning the early algebra ideas and practices. But one of the things certainly if it can build on what they're doing in arithmetic already and enhance what they learn as part of their regular arithmetic curriculum, and that's also something. So we had, a kind of indirect measure of that was looking at, for example, student performance on standardized tests to see whether, part of the argument is if we're coming in and doing early algebra, are we taking away however much time from the regular curriculum? For teachers and for parents and for administrators, we don't want to kind of take away. If students are doing worse on standardized assessments because they missed some content, that's problematic. And so we certainly wanted to show that it's doing no harm at the very least, with the idea that if it's enhancing what they're learning in arithmetic, that's an added bonus. Again, with our fancy acronyms, our three projects were LEAP 1, LEAP 2, and LEAP 3. I'll talk about each one a little bit. LEAP 1 and LEAP 2 I'll talk a little less about because LEAP 3 was kind of the cumulative project of the three. And then we also have three new kind of Project LEAP projects that I'll talk a little briefly about that we're kind of in the process with currently engaging in research on those projects. So for LEAP 1, it was really about testing a proof of concept. So LEAP 1 was we developed a comprehensive early algebra learning progression. So we kind of identified both from the research, from kind of a mathematical perspective, from curriculum and curriculum standards. We looked at if we were going to think about the development of algebraic ideas, what might that look like from 3rd grade up to 7th? And we stopped at 7th grade thinking that if students took out kind of more formal algebra in 8th grade, we were looking at what would that learning progression look like from grade 3 up to grade 7. We developed assessments to go along with the progression, so how were we going to measure student learning at each stage of the process. We also developed a series of lessons, so about 18 lessons per grade. So we had 18 lessons in grade 3, about 18 in grade 4, and about 18 in grade 5. And then we collected, again, as I mentioned, kind of proof of concept data. So we implemented our lessons in 6 classrooms with about 300 students. This study was cross-sectional, so the first couple of years were in developing the lessons, developing the progression, developing the assessments, and so when we implemented it, we implemented the grade 3 lessons in each of grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5. So we couldn't implement the grade 4 lessons because they didn't have the grade 3 lessons already, and so this was a one-year cross-sectional study where the idea we wanted to see was, one, are grade 3 students capable of understanding a more comprehensive treatment to these early algebra concepts and practices, and then also look how they compare to the grade 4 and grade 5 students.
How did you determine which schools, which classrooms in those schools that you were going to do the study with?
So it was a convenience sample, so it was near the where 2 of my colleagues were located in the Northeast, and so it was a school that they'd worked with, and the school was willing to let them come in. And so a member of our research team actually taught the lessons in the grade 3 classrooms, taught the lessons in the grade 4 and in the grade 5, and so they were willing to give up those kind of approximately 18 days over the course of the year in each of those classes. So I'm not going to go into great detail about the development of the learning progression and development of the rest of the materials. I mean, that would be a talk in and of itself, but I want to just kind of highlight a little bit of what went into this. So the curricular framework, we were thinking about what are the big ideas and practices that we want to emphasize. And so I've kind of talked about where kind of early algebra coalesced around those 4 kind of ideas. And so that's where we were kind of thinking about the big ideas and thinking practices, some of the core concepts, what it is we want students to learn. We developed the curricular progression, so the idea of what would we expect students to learn at each kind of grade level. Instructional sequence, so what would be the design of tasks and sequencing of those tasks and lessons that would help students progress along the progression from year to year. How would we measure what students are learning, and so we developed the assessments. And then also what levels of sophistication are students demonstrating as they go through the early algebra lessons. So how are they becoming more sophisticated in their understanding of algebra and how they apply different algebraic strategies and thinking. So the big ideas and practices, so as I mentioned before, kind of the early algebra research coalesced around the ideas. The one thing that's missing here is kind of the focus on representations, and that's kind of throughout the other parts of it. So whether functional thinking, the use of graphs and tables and symbols, so that kind of cuts across some of these themes. But our 3 main big ideas we focused on were things to do with mathematical equivalence or equality, dealing with expressions, dealing with equations, generalized arithmetic and functional thinking, and then the mathematical practices of generalizing, representing, justifying, and then reasoning with mathematical structure and relationships. So much of this was built off of Jim Cappett's work and his characterizations of how we think about algebra. Yes.
So I'm hoping you'll give specific examples of all this as well as previous slides.
Yep, it's coming. So this is just, I'm not expecting to read this, but this is just an example of the lesson materials that we developed for teachers. And so there was kind of the student worksheet that had the activity. There were things for teachers about some of the goals of the lesson, what were some of the algebraic ideas that we wanted to get through in the lesson, what were some of the kind of struggles or challenges they might have with student thinking. And then also for the districts, there's a connection to the core math so that the district, they didn't want to be implementing something that wasn't connected to some of the aims and goals of the district. And so the lessons that we designed, this is kind of what teachers were given, or that we, in this case, in LEAP 1, this is what our teacher was implementing, and then this is what in the later studies teachers had this type of lesson.
So I have a question.
Yep.
How much did you work? Did people in your research program go in and facilitate this with the
Yes.
kids? So it wasn't the teacher doing it?
Not in LEAP 1. Yeah.
And so from that I understand that.
Coming up,
Okay.
so there's LEAP 2 I'll talk about next, and then LEAP 3, and so, but these are the lessons that we developed as part of LEAP 1 and then implemented, and then the teachers actually use these lessons, and I'll talk a little bit about the professional development work with teachers and
Yeah,
being great.
okay.
Yeah. So the one takeaway result from LEAP 1 was just that, again, the intent of this project was kind of a proof of concept, and I'm not going to go into the results because I'll share some from the later projects, but the bottom line was that the grade 3 students seemed able to understand and do some of the early algebra that we were kind of hoping that they would learn and be able to do. And so the takeaway was, yes, it seems like there's something here. So LEAP 2 is where we wanted to actually test the effectiveness of the program, and so we were actually going to do then a longitudinal study, so we did a quasi-experimental longitudinal study to test the effectiveness. In this case, in LEAP 2, was still a researcher-led implementation. So a member of our research team taught the lessons in grade 3, then followed those students into grade 4, taught those students in grade 4, and then followed those students and then taught those students in grade 5. So we followed about 170 students that started in grade 3, so there were 6 intervention classrooms in which a member of our team taught the lessons, and then there were 4 comparison classrooms which were just doing kind of business as usual elementary curriculum. Our measures, we gave kind of a pre-test at the beginning of grade 3 and a post-test end of grade 4 and grade 3 and grade 4 and into grade 5. We also did some yearly interviews with a subset of students to kind of get a little bit more in-depth into their thinking than you could learn from a written assessment. And then we also collected state standardized test data so that we could see, again, to the earlier question about whether students, were we doing by taking away these 18 kind of lessons per year from the 3rd grade, the 4th grade, and the 5th grade, that we weren't doing students any harm with regard to standardized, assessment. So again, I'm just going to share briefly the results here. I'll get into more detail on LEAP 3, but this is just correctness only. So this has nothing to do with the strategy that students used in solving some of the problems. So what's being shown here too is, I should say, on the assessment, there were a core set of activities that ran from grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5. So all students saw some same core so we could measure longitudinal growth in their understanding, but then there were also grade level specific items. So there were some items that only grade 3 students saw, some items that only grade 4 students, and likewise in grade 5. And so this, again, is only correctness. I'll talk more about some of the strategies coming up. And so one thing to note too is you might look in grade 5 and say, well, it looks like around 65% is correctness. That's a D. That's not very good. But keep in mind the idea was that we designed the items so that they were going to be challenging. We didn't want every student to get 100%, and then there was not going to be much to learn from that. And so, so in this case, the items were designed to be challenging for the students. So briefly, the results, there was no significant difference at pre-test, so the students in the comparison classrooms looked relatively the same as the students in the intervention classrooms. The intervention students significantly outperformed the students at each post-test, so at grade 3 post-test, grade 4, and grade 5. And they also demonstrated increasingly more sophisticated algebraic strategies in the way that they responded to the items. And again, I'll share some of that in a moment. But we saw not only were they doing better on the algebraic items, but they were demonstrating more sophisticated algebraic ways of solving the items and responding to the items. So I know I'm kind of running through this relatively quickly, but I'll spend a little bit more time now on LEAP 3. So this was kind of the culminating project of the 3. So in this case, we were again testing the effectiveness of the intervention, but now it was going to be in the hands of the regular classroom teachers. So what would it look like if regular classroom teachers were implementing our lessons? So LEAP 2 was kind of the best case scenario. So given kind of an expert that's very familiar with the LEAP curriculum materials that we developed, very familiar with early algebra, has teaching experience, kind of what would that look like in that best case scenario? And now in LEAP 3, we're looking at, okay, what's it going to look like in real life? And so that was the purpose of this LEAP 3. So this was, again, a teacher-led implementation. It was a large-scale randomized longitudinal study. So we had about 3,500 grade 3 students. We had 23 intervention classrooms and 23 control classrooms. And we collected data through grade 6. So again, going back to the goal of LEAP 3 was to answer the question, does early algebra matter? Part of the challenge, and I'll come back to this later, has to do with funding cycles. I mean, most grants are 3 or 4 years. For us, we wanted to measure the effectiveness of the early algebra program, so grade 3, 4, and 5, but with a 4-year grant cycle, we collected data in grade 6. As much as we wanted to collect data in grade 7 and even grade 8, there was no funding mechanism for just kind of, can we get some money just to collect some data in grade 7 and 8? There's not new research that we're doing, we just want to administer these assessments. And I'll come back to that kind of challenge of doing this kind of longitudinal research kind of towards the latter part of the talk. But that's part of the reason why we stopped in grade 6. It would have been nice to be able to share with you grade 7 data and grade 8 data, but unfortunately that didn't happen. We also collected fidelity of implementation data with a random sample of about 40 to 50 teachers each year, so we wanted to get a sense of, how are the teachers implementing the lessons, and we also wanted to tie that to student performance, so we could look at things like, if teachers were implementing the lessons really well, did their students perform any better than teachers that weren't implementing it as well? So that was part of the idea for that. And one of our later projects that I'll also talk to about was looking at, for teachers that really had high gains in student performance, what was it that they were doing differently in their classrooms than teachers that didn't have that kind of gains in student performance?
Yeah, was this again cross-sectional? So you started with grade 3 and then?
This was longitudinal, so we started with a grade 3, the 3,500 grade 3 students, followed that group of students into grade 4, followed that group of students into grade 5, followed that group of students into grade 6. There was certainly some, attrition each year for various reasons, but that was, roughly the same cohort that we followed through each year. And then we also had monthly professional development for the teachers. And so the professional development was not meant to be real intensive, so we weren't trying to kind of change teachers' understandings of early algebra and kind of their knowledge of algebra. We didn't have the time and resources to do that, so the monthly PD was basically about they're teaching, okay, the next 3 lessons that you're going to be teaching, here's professional, we'd go through the lessons with the teachers so they had familiarity with what was the goal, what was some of the content, what were some of the challenges that might come up with students. Certainly they may have gained an understanding of some of the early algebra as a result of engaging in those activities, but the PD itself was not designed to kind of enhance teacher knowledge and practices. It was really to gain familiarity with the lessons, the goals of the lesson, kind of things that might come up in the lessons when working with the students, so that then when they were implementing it, wasn't like, this is the first time I'm seeing it, first time I'm thinking about it, so it was really to prepare them for doing that set of lessons that were going to be upcoming into the next professional development meeting. But part of that professional development, we also had videos from Leap 2 of the teacher implementing some of the lessons. So they actually got to see kind of what it looked like when a teacher was implementing these lessons with students in a real elementary classroom, and so it wasn't just kind of the teachers themselves engaging in the activity and talking about it, but there were other kind of examples to see student work and kind of make sense of the student work that was going on and things like that.
Eric,
Yes.
had these teachers had PD in other instances for math, for their classes, or was this their first or only PD?
For most, it was kind of the first that really focused on early algebra. So we did collect a lot of data about the teachers, and again, I'm not going to go into the detail today on that, but we collected a lot of detail in terms of years of teaching experience, background, professional development, opportunities they've been through, how often, and things like that, so we could have an idea. And we're interested, certainly, in looking at, in the end, was there something special about the teachers in the classrooms in which students really showed lots of growth? And so that was one of the kind of research questions that we were interested in. So we did collect a lot of that kind of detail. In addition to the fidelity of the implementation detail, we also kind of had surveys. We looked at the curriculum of what the teachers were using on a regular basis, and what, were there opportunities for algebraic thinking that happened in the curriculum that they were using in the schools. And, so a lot of that data we were also looking at.
So just to be more specific, the reason I'm asking the question is, doing PD with elementary teachers as opposed to secondary, each cohort has pluses and minuses in terms of working with them, which I'm not going to go into, I'm sure it's obvious, but since elementary teachers generally are not math ed people, they're elementary people, were they intimidated by this? Were they eager? Were they excited? Were they afraid? Like, that's kind of, what was the affect?
Yeah, I would say it probably ran the gamut, right? Certainly there's going to be, and so one of the things was also, like in the initial, during the summer, we had, a few days of PD with the teachers to kick off, before the school year started, in part to kind of hopefully get them excited about doing it, share some of the results from the previous studies we've done to show that, look at some of the amazing things that students are capable of doing, and so really kind of trying to sell it to the teachers in a sense. But yeah, certainly some of the teachers, and in some cases those were the teachers that didn't implement it with high fidelity, that they, either for lack of kind of an understanding of what the purpose of some of the lessons was, or for lack of, I don't want to do this. This is an imposition, and I'll just do the minimum. And so, you get the complete gamut from teachers that love it and are going beyond and doing more things on a more regular basis when they're not doing the leap lesson. And so you get a whole kind of
nice
spectrum.
cross-section.
So go into a little bit of detail so you can see some of the kind of nature of some of the assessment items and some of the student responses. So each assessment was approximately 10 to 12 items per grade level. The items addressed the big ideas and practices that I mentioned earlier. There was, as I mentioned, there was a core set of items that ran grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, and even into grade 6. And then there were the non-core items that increased in difficulty, so they were grade level appropriate, so there were items just for grade 3 students or just for grade 5 students. And still focused on the same big ideas and practices, but were more kind of demanded more of the student in understanding the particular big ideas and practices. So some of the sample items, so these are some of the items we had for related to the idea of equivalence. So number sentence, fill in the blank with value that makes the following number sentence true. How did you get your answer? Many of you that if you know kind of any of the work around the equal sign, kind of know what many of the students put in the blank for this case. But this was one to look at kind of how well, what do they understand about the equal sign? What are some of their ways of kind of explaining where they got the answer? The second one, circle true or false, explain your choice. So these are kind of representative of the kinds of items that focused on the equal sign or equivalence. So here's kind of a typical student response. If you know the research around the equal sign, this is often talked about as an operational view of the equal sign, where the equal sign really is viewed as an operator by the student. It means the answer comes next. So it doesn't matter what's further to the right of the equal sign, it's just whatever was to the left, put the answer down to the right. So this was a typical response, and the student explained how he or she got the answer was just by adding 7 plus 3 to get 10.
Okay, but what about that plus 4? Oh, you want that, okay.
Yeah, right, no, so in this case, but for many of the students, the plus 4 doesn't have anything to do with finding the answer to this problem. So here another student has the correct answer of 6. In this case, the student kind of unwound the problem, so 7 plus 3 equals 10. So I did 10 minus 4 to figure out the answer was 6. So more sophisticated strategy, correct strategy, right, in this case compared to the previous student, but the student is, doing, a bit of unwinding the problem. Here's a typical solution similar to the first one with the operational view of the equal sign. So in this case, the student adds 57 plus 22. That doesn't equal 58, so the answer is false to this one. And then here we see another student does a computational approach, adds the numbers on the right, adds the numbers on the left, and sees that they're equal and concludes it's true. Yes?
Let's go back one.
This one or one more?
One more. Is this included in what grade is this included in Common Core?
In Common Core?
Yeah,
Well,
because it involves both an addition and a subtraction in the same problem.
well, it depends on how the student solved it. It doesn't have to. So I'll show another example in a moment that, as you know, you don't have to, subtraction doesn't have to enter into formally the equation. But it's, so in the Common Core, there's things about the understanding the equal sign that are in there. And so this one is really, these tasks were designed to look at how students understand the idea of the equal sign.
Well, I raised it because my impression is that in Common Core, having a problem with both an addition and a subtraction may be postponed till grade 6.
It doesn't have to be subtraction, it's
I understand.
relation.
Yeah. And so again, on this one, it was just the student computed both sides. Here we see a student that didn't do any computation, so reasoned about it more about the quantities. So the student here says, he or she knows it's true because the student notices they're just taking 1 from the 22, moving it to the 57, and see that you get 58 plus 21. So here the student doesn't do any computing. It's thinking about it more structurally, thinking about the relationships here. And for us, this is a more sophisticated algebraic strategy. The student is reasoning about quantities rather than either computing or making kind of the operational error that students often do. A couple examples of the generalized arithmetic items. So the first one is about the commutative property. And also, clearly things about the equal sign will come up here if students have misconceptions about the equal sign. And then the second one was more looking kind of a number theory type problem, the sum of 3 odd numbers. Student claims will always get an odd number and try to explain why. So in this case, the student says it's true because it's just a flip around and it equals the same thing. So in a lot of elementary classrooms, these are referred to as flip around facts or turnaround facts. And so in this case, the student, whether the student recognizes or how the student would explain this. In this case, the student is just saying, kind of referring to something that probably came up in class as it's a flip around. isn't really showing, okay, that doesn't necessarily explain why. I mean, the student may have learned why in class, but this is how he or she is kind of justifying it.
But
In this case, the student is kind of adding both sides, again, doing a computation approach and saying, okay, it equals the same thing. We also see students that do other, justifications for the community property, whether it's array-based or, other things that students might do as well.
So on that one, oh, no. Did you supply any ones where they were adding 3 or 4 numbers and you changed the order?
Not in this assessment. And then here's kind of some of the 3 odd numbers problem. So in this case, the student says it's true because if you add 5 plus 7 plus 3, you get 15. That's an odd number, so that makes any 3 odd numbers odd. And so again, if you know anything about students' kind of justifications in elementary school and middle school, unfortunately sometimes high school, but often rely on empirical evidence, often suffices for many students as justification. And so in this case, it's not surprising that, in this case, only one example was enough to convince a student that it's always going to be the case. Here we see a student kind of putting together a kind of a logical deductive chain, in this case based on some kind of accepted facts for this particular grade level. So here the student says, it's true because if you add any 2 odd numbers, you get an even number. And then if you take an odd number and add that to an even number, you get an odd number. So he's making a deductive chain based on these 2 kind of accepted facts in elementary school. Here we see a student doing more of a kind of representational-based argument where the student is kind of using the idea that even numbers can be paired, odd number always has one left, and so the student is kind of showing that if we take, using kind of a generic example in this case, so the student is showing if you do 3 plus 5, the 2 kind of leftovers combine, so you still have an even number, we can pair them all up, but then if you add another odd number, you have the 1 left over, so it's going to be odd. So the student, again, here is using a nice generic example to demonstrate that this is always going to be the case. Sample functional thinking activity. So Brady is having his friends over for a birthday party. He wants to make sure he has seats for everyone. He has square tables, and then they're shown you can seat 4 at the table in this way, and then you can seat 6 at the table if you add another. And then it was followed by a number of series of questions, like what if you had 3 tables? What if you had 4? What if you had 20 tables? Can you write an expression? Can you explain in words, what the general relationship is, and so forth. So here's one of the kind of follow-up questions is write a rule that describes the relationship between the number of tables and the number of people who can sit. So in this case, the student is viewing it recursively, recognizing that each time you add another table, you're just adding 2. So it's not going to really help the student, kind of if we say, oh, there's 50 tables, it's going to be a lot of computing to do before the student would be able to figure that out. But the student kind of sees the pattern, sees it recursively. His or her use of variables, I think in this case, the student knew a variable was a letter, I'll throw a couple letters in, and somehow you get the equals 2 kind of falls in. So it's a little bit unclear with and that's, with the written assessment, we can't ask the student, so exactly what were you thinking? A plus B equals 2, how did that relate to the problem? But that was his or her kind of attempt to symbolize it. We see another student writing in words, number of desks times 2 plus 2 equals number of people seated, and then this student represents it with D times 2 plus 2 equals P. So this student clearly demonstrates something a little bit different than the previous student did in terms of his or her ability to represent it symbolically.
Which grade was that? 3rd grade?
To be honest with you, I don't remember what grade. It's probably on my computer. I can find it if you're.
No, that's nice.
Yeah. So this is the results just for the core items. So these were the same items that every grade 3 student saw, every grade 4 student saw, and every grade 5 student saw. And again, it's only correctness at this point. Slides with strategies become pretty complicated because there's lots of different strategies that students employ, and it just makes it hard to see. But you can see again, similar to League 2, we saw pretty strong results at each grade. Students looked pretty similar at pre-test in grade 3. And this was looking across all items. So this is the core items as well as those items that were only grade level specific. And we still see the similar trend. And this is also correctness. We don't see quite as high as we did with just the core items. but there's still statistically significant differences at each grade level.
I'm assuming these are the same students,
Yes, same students.
so what's the attrition?
By so I think we started with around 3,500 students that we were following in grade 3. By grade 5, I think it was around 3,100. So still lots of students, we still had enough power for looking at effect sizes.
Is there any way to describe the increased learning?
I'm sorry, say,
Any way to describe this, the increased learning, the amount of increased learning that it?
well, I mean, one way to describe it was the lessons, the leap lessons that enhance their algebra. I mean, that's part of it, right? We don't know, we weren't there for the entire school year to know if the teachers were, doing other things that supported the development of student understanding and some of these algebraic ideas and practices. So that certainly could have enhanced. But at least the comparison, I mean, you certainly see growth in the comparison students, right? So they are learning something about these early algebra ideas and practices, but not as much as they do from, materials that are specifically designed to help students learn some of these ideas and practices. So quickly, just again, a brief summary. There was no significant differences at pretest. The students looked the same on the early algebra assessment. Intervention students outperformed the comparison students at each time point. They also demonstrated more sophisticated use of strategies than the students did. So when you look back at some of the samples that I showed, like the student who was able to think about kind of more of a compensation strategy with the sum, thinking about, well, you're really just taking one away from one number and adding one to the other. So we saw more of those kinds of strategies, students learning to symbolize, like the functional thinking item. Students were able to represent kind of the functional task with symbols, or in a correct algebraic way that comparison students weren't able to do. And then we also saw students in classrooms in which teachers demonstrated greater fidelity, also outperform students in lower fidelity classrooms, so which shouldn't be a surprise, but I mean, we have the evidence that actually show that was the case as well. So coming to the question of does early algebra matter, and this is something I'd be interested in any insights that some of you might have. And so this graph here shows the grade 6 data, and this is again only correctness, so it doesn't look at any of the strategies. So we see similar trends in the sense that the students that were in the LEAP program intervention, they're still outperforming the students that were in the comparison, but you'll notice there's a significant drop when they get to grade 6. So they're still outperforming kind of the comparison students in grade 6, but we don't see the kind of similar trend. We're a bit puzzled by that. So I mean, some of the conjectures which we don't have evidence at this point to back up, but thinking about if some of the grade 6 curriculum really didn't kind of elicit some of the algebraic thinking and strategies that students had learned in grade 3 through 5, then that might not surface at that point. So it might be the case that as soon as they start getting more into pre-algebra and starting to work with some of these ideas again, maybe that knowledge kind of comes back into play. They've got that foundation from which they can draw. But it's interesting, again, we did some look at the grade 6 curriculum to see whether there was a lack of kind of algebra going on in the grade 6, and it wasn't a strong kind of algebraic presence in the grade 6, but it's still just a conjecture that if they weren't seeing the algebra, there's may or may not be a reason why we'd expect to kind of see that. If it wasn't kind of continually kind of supported and revisited, might be one thing.
At the sites that you were at, and maybe this, or if this varied, was grade 5 sort of the end of elementary school with one class, one teacher, and then grade 6 was middle
Right.
school where they have different teachers for each subject?
Yes.
Was the, I guess the district, were they implementing the Common Core standards? That, the normal curriculum?
Their standards were guided by the Common Core.
Because there could be a lot of researchers saying that 6E, that domain in 6th grade is one of the most important standards, and if you don't have a teacher with that conceptual understanding, it's very difficult for students to grasp that whole domain, and that really sets them up for algebra in general.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I kind of alluded to earlier too, in terms of I wish we had data from grade 7 and grade 8 to see, is it that the kind of their algebraic understanding is kind of dormant in a sense, and then it's going to come back into play when they're really starting to address some of these algebraic ideas again? Or is it a matter of, without kind of this sustained, focus on some of this algebraic thinking, that if you kind of take a year off from it, you lose it? I mean, that's also a possibility. So it's kind of, again, we're not sure exactly what was going on. And I wish we had the data in grade 7 and grade 8 to see if it continually dropped off, or did it jump back up, or what happened. Yeah, Andrew?
Are the tests linked? I mean, part of it just could be that the items on grade 6.
So
were more
the tests are
difficult.
linked in that there was still a core set of, so this doesn't, one graph, and to be honest, I don't remember now whether if we look only at the core items, I think we see the similar trend that grade 6 still dropped down relative to what the kind of increasing trend we saw through grades 2 through 5. I don't remember for sure, but I'm pretty confident that that was also the case, that the drop-off might not have been quite as much, but that there was still a drop-off. But there were some grade 6 items that were, not part, like we weren't teaching the curriculum anymore, so our intervention stopped in grade 5. In grade 6, we added some grade 6 appropriate kind of items based on our learning progression, that it may not be, those just weren't addressed in grade 6, and so that could also speak to some of that drop-off. Yes?
So I don't know if you're going to get to this, so if you are, you can just wait and get to my question later. But this is the part where the classroom teachers were doing the instruction, right? So I had a question about like controlling for teacher knowledge and teacher quality. In what ways did you kind of think about that as you wanted to look at the control groups and the intervention groups?
So we collected minimal data from comparison teachers. So we weren't in their classrooms, we weren't watching what they were doing. We had some surveys that all teachers filled out so we could get an idea, for example, self-report of how often do you do kind of teach algebra, not in those words, but like how often do you focus on kind of multiple representations, or so we highlighted in asking teachers to self-report how often do you at all, how often do you get at these, and we looked at the curriculum with the intervention students or intervention teachers. We did have the random sample that we did do observations in their classrooms so we could get an idea. And so we also, part of our analysis was also looking at kind of student performance relative to the FOI data. So looking at teachers who were implementing it with greater fidelity, how did their students perform relative to teachers who were implementing it with lower fidelity. We did see a positive correlation in that sense.
But when you think about what we know about the ways in which a teacher knowledge shows up as a really important resource for the quality of the instruction that they're providing, the ways in which they're able to hear different interpretations of things that students are doing, the way in which somebody might even be able to use what you're creating. I was curious about, because that might shape the way that one interprets a control and a treatment, and also understanding the curriculum. Like, was it controlled for that?
So part of the observations for fidelity and implementation had to do with not only so one aspect of fidelity is, did they do the lesson, right? I mean, if the teacher just did something else the day we were there, that's
Right.
not very good fidelity. So part of it was, did they do the lesson? But then part of kind of in doing the observations and kind of coding the observations was also kind of how well in terms of, did they pick up on some of the student ideas that were brought up in the classroom? Did if the student mentioned kind of if it was an equal sign kind of lesson, and the students brought up kind of the operational view of the equal sign, did the teacher kind of do something with that or take an opportunity? So did they reinforce ideas about so for example, some teachers, when they were doing open number sentences, they might scaffold for students and say, remember, we've got put a box around the left side, a box around the right side, that helps the students, and they talk about balance. And so those are the kinds of things that we kind of looked for in the observations as well, and that might speak some to your point about a teacher with kind of a greater understanding of algebra is going to know, okay, these are some of the challenges, these are ways I can scaffold some of these ideas. Something that student said, that's a pretty important point. I want to make sure that comes up into the classroom space so that we can talk about that. And so that was part of the fidelity kind of data. When I say teachers who implemented with greater fidelity, it wasn't just that 100% fidelity meant they did the lesson, but greater fidelity also meant they did it well in the sense that they picked up on student kind of thinking and kind of highlighted things that they knew students might struggle with and things like that. So we talked a little bit about this, and I just want to also be conscious of time if there's more questions kind of towards the end if you didn't have a chance to ask. But as I've mentioned a little bit, you know, the question of will early algebra pay off is somewhat still an open question. I mean, we saw still positive results in grade 6, but it wasn't as positive as we were seeing in grade 5, for example, and not knowing, okay, when students are in algebra, the students that went through the LEAP intervention, did they actually perform? Are they more successful in algebra? At this point, we still kind of don't have that. Some of the challenges that came up certainly had to do with funding, you know, because as I mentioned before, funding cycles, but also participant challenges. That's a long time to ask kids and parents to continue to, you know, be involved, and when they go to elementary school, kind of we were doing things in the elementary school. We had professional development for the teachers, we were giving, you know, the intervention. Grade 6, 7, and 8, we were just asking them, could you do the assessment for us, and can we collect that? And then, so, you know, sometimes we ran into schools, you know, the administrator changed that was no longer kind of interested, and so there's lots of these challenges in the kind of longitudinal work to be able to continue to do that. Participants drop out, parents decide they no longer want their child involved in it. So there's, you know, lots of challenges associated with that.
Eric,
Yes.
maybe this is naive of me, but are you familiar with the Kenilworth longitudinal study, the amount of records directed by Denmark? So I was part of that. And that was from first grade through college, and the parents and the schools were thrilled to have that. So this is where my naivety comes in. The parents and the schools were resistant to having, I mean, to me, this seems like a phenomenal gift that they got from you guys.
That's what we thought. I mean, that's still what we think. Yeah, I mean, so part of it, you know, so one of the challenges, it's hard to know in hindsight that we're going to get positive results, right? I mean, that's what we hoped. And so, like the IRB, when we did consent forms with parents, it was just through the end of, you know, grade 6. We weren't thinking, okay, our grant is for 4 years. We're not going to try to consent parents to, you know, please consent to your students in high school so we can continue to follow it. So then it's also a matter of the logistics of now we have to, IRB, we have to go back to every student that was in the study, kind of find them at different schools again and get them to re-consent for grade 7 and 8. At that point, you know, parents, so it becomes logistically challenging to continue to do that. So like, again, in hindsight, I wish we would have done, you know, the consent all the way through so we could have followed the students. But again, you get changes in administrators too, that even if you're kind of showing them, we've got these positive results that we think this really can help a lot more students be successful in algebra, you get administrators, new administrators that may have different goals and, you know, the school already is impacted with things, and so finding the space to do these 18, or at least in middle school there wasn't any intervention, but just, you know, it's giving up a day to do the assessments that we just don't, we're already doing too many assessments, we don't want to, so there's, you know, a variety of reasons I think that come up, and especially for the number of students that we were following, and that's a lot of logistics for, you know, a relatively small research team to try to manage. So real quickly, I'll kind of end at this point to come up with questions, but as a follow-up, so some of the things we're doing now, so we've got LEAP 5, so again, we've got our clever names of LEAP 4, 4. I'm not going to go into why 4.1 and 4.2, but there was some rationale behind that. And then LEAP 5 is the V, because it's a video study, so I see how that worked out. So LEAP 5, we're actually looking at the fidelity of implementation data to look at what kinds of instructional practices were happening in classrooms that were, you know, of teachers who were correlated with higher student performance, trying to understand what was going on in their practices. LEAP 4 is about extending the early algebra intervention to K3 or K2, and so we're kind of taking our early algebra progression to the idea of making a K5 early algebra intervention, and so that's where the LEAP 4 and 4.2 we're working, and 4.2 is actually looking at students from at-risk populations, so trying to be more both students with learning challenges as well as culturally relevant pedagogies, trying to bring that into the early algebra, so we're doing something in one of the projects that's more related to that. So I'm not going to... So I've mentioned some of the challenges already with long-term kind of programs of work that I think it's really a challenge. we've also run into this kind of dissemination saturation because Leap 1, Leap 2, and Leap 3 all focused on early algebra, grade 3 through 5 intervention. I mean, how many times can you say, even different data sets, but how many times are people going to want to read? Yeah, we've seen positive results in, you know, our intervention, and so we've even had a couple instances where we've submitted manuscripts where reviewers have said, you know, isn't this the same kind of results or same data, you know, that I read in this article? And it's like, no, that was a different study, and so it's, you know, it's an interesting, it's a nice thing to have, but it's also an interesting phenomenon where we're thinking, okay, where haven't we submitted before that we can maybe submit a paper? And so it's an interesting issue to think about what new can we say too, even if it's new data sets. Okay, the LEAP intervention seems to make a difference, but we've said that kind of a couple times over now. You know, what more can we say about it? So I mean, it's a good problem, an interesting one. Then the other question is just kind of that we have wrestled with is bringing it to scale. So we've done this large-scale randomized study. We've got, you know, at least positive results through grade 6. How do we move beyond that? So as part of our own personal kind of graduate preparation, I mean, I never kind of learned anything about kind of even doing a large-scale study was new for me. But then moving beyond, I mean, how do we get this in the hands of more teachers? I mean, what do we do next? I mean, we've got something we think would make a difference in the lives of lots of elementary children. What next? I mean, what do we? I mean, we're not curriculum developers. We're not publishers, and so thinking about issues of, you know, how do we reach out to more schools and districts to get this work out there? You know, how many of them are reading kind of the manuscripts that we've published and things like that. So I mean, it's an interesting thing to even think about in your own kind of graduate kind of training for those of you who are students who are thinking about, you know, maybe thinking about taking a class on policy and thinking about how do we move beyond kind of these small-scale positive results that we may have in math ed to kind of branching out to really making a more substantial difference beyond our kind of local context, and, you know, thinking about what kind of preparation or what kind of work would help do that. And then also thinking about what, you know, we can't just kind of make LEAP available to anyone that wants to use it without some sort of kind of professional development behind it. So, you know, our team of, you know, the 4 of us, and we have, you know, many other postdocs and others that have been involved in the work, but we're a relatively small team. We can't be going across the country doing professional development, and so, you know, there's very few. I think CGI is a nice model that really scaled up nationally, but, you know, how do you make that happen? And so I think that's, you know, another kind of interesting kind of discussion for a whole other thing. But I do want to thank just the members of so this wasn't by any stretch my own kind of work. A lot of collaborators, Maria Blanton and Angela Gardner at Turk, Anna Stevens, colleague at Wisconsin, and then as well as lots of postdocs and graduate students who have worked on LEAP over the years. So I'm happy to entertain any questions. If you want more information about LEAP or any of our papers and things, you can kind of go to 2 of our websites, have a lot of that information.